Okay, so for the remainder of these plant modules, what we're going to do is the same thing we've done, but we're going to put it on its head. Instead of talking about the synapomorphies and the trends in terrestrialization, we're going to talk about the lineages of life, the clades that represent those anatomies, those ways of living, those functions. We're doing biodiversity of plants. Let's do a review question. So here are some plants. We've got a fern, a gymnosperm, angiosperm, and they're all vascular plants. So what is the synapomorphy that they all share as vascular plants? Again, pause your computer. The answer here is, well, you'd think vascular tissue, and so E is the answer. Tracheids and vessel elements, these specific types of cells that move, in this case, mostly water, through the wood of the plant, from the roots up through the top. So the vascular tissue, and specifically these kinds of cells, are the synapomorphies. The other traits, can you name the clade that these define? So what clade defines cones? Yep, that's the gymnosperms. Which one is flowers? You got that, the flowering plants. You could have thrown fruit here if you wanted it more challenging. What about heterospory or heterospory, seeds and pollen? That's the seed plants, or the pollen plants, or the heterosporous plants. Retention of the embryo, what group of plants is that? Yep, that's all land plants. Good job. Okay, so here's the phylogeny that we saw before. And basically, you can see these major synapomorphies that define the big clades: angiosperms, gymnosperms. If I were you, I'd put cones here. Seed plants, vascular plants, land plants. Now what we're going to do is walk through the different ways that plants can survive. We've got our non-vascular plants, we have our seedless vascular plants, and then we've got our seed plants. And so we're basically going to focus on mosses, ferns, and then we'll go through some of the gymnosperms and then end with the angiosperms. So for this set of modules, we're going to focus at the beginning and then we'll work our way through these major groups. What we did in the last modules is basically talk about the different synapomorphies that evolved that allowed plants over time to evolve better ability to survive on a dry land and support themselves. And we're not going to go through that again. But here again, you can see where mosses fit in, what they have, but what they don't have. Where the ferns fit in, they've got these things, but not these things, etc. And we also did the same thing with reproduction. A lot of complicated adaptations for reproducing on land, but we're going to do the same thing. Focus on the mosses, the ferns, the gymnosperms, and the angiosperms. So let's start with the non-vascular plants. If you look here, or on either of these earlier phylogenies, you can see that we're not entirely sure the relationships of a lot of these early groups. There aren't that many species, there aren't that many people who are specialists, but this group here, the non-vascular plants, are paraphyletic. The common ancestor was a non-vascular plant, meaning it doesn't have vascular tissue, and some of the descendants, the vascular plants, are excluded. So this group here is paraphyletic. Typically, when things are defined by what they're not, an invertebrate, a non-bird dinosaur, a non-vascular plant, a seedless plant, these are paraphyletic names. Let's focus on the mosses. So the mosses are actually a remarkably diverse and successful group of life. Although they represent a pretty ancient way of living, they branched off a long time ago, 400 million years or so ago. There's still more than 10,000 species of mosses on Earth today. So that's a large number. That's about the same number of species as birds, and by any measure, birds are incredibly successful. There's more species of moss than mammals, to put that in perspective. So very diverse and successful group of life. In general, we're going to use them as our example of a non-vascular plant, meaning no xylem, no phloem, no vascular cells, no tracheids, no wood, no true roots. Because of that, these plants are all generally going to be really small because they can't move fluids through their body. Otherwise, they dry out, and they need to live in areas that are damp and moist. So typically the habitats we see them are in shady areas or in the lower kind of shadier parts of forests that are moist, or by streams or ponds or lakes, or in bogs, swampy environments where it's inherently kind of moist all the time. They can't survive by and large in dry areas. They just don't have the anatomy to survive that. They're small plants, and they don't have true roots because they don't have wood. There's no lignin. And so we call the roots either rootlets, but the technical name is a rhizoid. Rhizoid is a fancy word for kind of root-like. And they're little shallow roots that sit more at the surface. They don't really push into the dirt. They sit at the surface, drinking a lot of water. And the most mosses are only maybe a centimeter or two tall. The world record holders are maybe a foot tall. These are small plants, again, representing kind of relative, um, kind of give you a sense of what the earliest plants were probably living like. They don't have true leaves. Remember, leaves were a pretty late thing to evolve, and so the mosses inherit that non-leafy condition. The leaves are called scales, little kind of extensions. Reproductively, alternation of generations dominated by the gametophyte generation with a sporophyte that can't survive on its own. So the sporophyte's job is basically to produce a little spore capsule, a sporangium at the top, release the spores into the wind, coated with sporopollenin, and then they die and the gametophyte moss goes on living. And like all plants, there needs to be moisture, in this case, rain or in the environment for the sperm to swim out of the antheridium and into the archegonium where the eggs are. So here's this life cycle that by now it used to be very hard for you and frustrating and complicated, but now this is easy. We've got our gametophyte dominant mosses with their little tiny rhizoid roots with little scales for leaves, never more than a few inches tall. They have antheridia that produce the sperm by mitosis. They have archegonia that produce the eggs by mitosis. You need to wait for it to be rainy or moist for the sperm to swim out of the antheridium and into an archegonium where it fertilizes the egg. That fertilization starts the sporophyte cell that, as it does mitosis to grow, will grow out of the archegonium. Remember, we're retaining the embryo in the parent archegonium. It grows out. Eventually, it's mature. It makes a sporangium. The sporangium makes spores by meiosis. This is the only point where meiosis happens. The spores are coated by that chemical sporopollenin, so they won't dry out even for decades in some cases. The wind blows them away. And then if it's moist or it rains or they find a nice patch of moist soil, it starts over. So this is the life of a moss, representing this early group of life. They do have, kind of like stomata, they do have simple pores to move fluids through their body, but they don't have vascular tissue. They don't have true roots. There's no true tracheids, vessel elements, any of that stuff. Here's the world of mosses: damp, moist, shady areas. They dry out very easily. In cold climates that are moist, like swampy northern Canada or Scotland, you can have a habitat that's dominated by mosses. This is a peat bog. The soil here tends to be very acidic because there's not a lot of life, and because of the chemicals that these organisms produce. You can see trees really have a hard time here. It's a little bit difficult. Um, and this environment is a great place, moist. Usually they are okay with some degree of acid. And so it's a really distinctive kind of swampy, cold, kind of northern climate. This is one of the biggest mosses on Earth, sphagnum moss. So this is the world of mosses. And in areas like Scotland, where it's so desolate and north that you can't really use wood for trees because trees don't, or wood for burning to build a house, like a log cabin in olden days, or to make fuel to cook with or heat your house. Since there aren't really trees in this environment, they grow so slowly, you can actually dig up the swamp. Um, Pull out these kind of really thousands of years worth of generations of moss that are growing on top of each other over time. They get compacted and it forms kind of a brick that looks like dirt but is rich in plant matter. It's compacted, so it's very dense, so it's kind of solid, and you can burn this as a source of fuel. Those of you who know people who are into a alcoholic beverage called Scotch, which is basically the whiskey of Scotland, often Scotch is famous for very weird flavors as alcoholic beverages go, and many of those weird flavors are because the traditional way of making Scotch, you need to boil the alcohol. They're going to use sphagnum moss, kind of peat bog it's not wood, but carbon as the source of fuel. And so the burning of this kind of creates a distinctive smoky smell that often will imbue itself within the scotch. So kind of a slight food connection, or somewhat. Okay, so that is the mosses. We'll call this module, we'll do the ferns in the next one.